But I'd now like to welcome our final speaker in this first session, Peter Varghese, Chancellor of the University of Queensland. Prior to this appointment, he served as Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as a number of other senior foreign roles. So please welcome him and his insights into international outlook. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nikolai, and good morning to all of you. Steve, can I thank ABS for the opportunity to join you this morning. I've been asked to speak about the geopolitical outlook that Australia faces, and you may well ask, why is that particularly relevant to the very weighty issues that your conference program is addressing? So let me make two broad points on relevance before I get into my remarks. The first is that we live in a very complicated ecosystem, and you all understand ecosystems from an agricultural point of view. But the reality is that all of our markets are nested in this complicated ecosystem, and that ecosystem is shaped as much by the subterranean trends of geopolitics and domestic politics as it is by factors such as productivity or sustainability or supply and demand. And you only have to think about Australia's agricultural access to other countries to register that point, because government policies in other countries very much shape, for good or ill, our ability to penetrate those markets. And the second reason is, I think within that ecosystem, we are now at a point in time where we are shifting from a period where economics dominated to a period where the political economy is increasingly shaping our external environment. For the last several decades, I think we've had a measure of consensus, whether in developed, mature economies or in emerging economies, on the broad outlines of economic policy. At one stage, that was called the Washington Consensus. That seems no longer to be a term of approval, but by and large, most of our economies in the developed world, including in Australia, was driven by some of the fundamental tenets of the Washington Consensus, and that was all about market open and liberalisation and deregulation and making our economies more efficient and productive. And equally, I think in our part of the world, in emerging economies, there was a broad consensus on what created economic growth, and that's reflected in the East Asian model with its emphasis on exports and fixed investment. Well, I think we're now moving into a very different period of political economy, and regrettably, one of the features of that period is going to be the rising strength of populism and the way in which populist politics is going to shape economic choices. And you can think about populism in this way. It is the situation you arrive at when bad policy becomes good politics. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that over the next 2 decades. Now, when I look out at Australia's geoeconomic or geopolitical environment, what strikes me most is that we are facing, if I can adapt a phrase from Tom Wolfe, a bonfire of certainties, because so much of the framing principles that have guided our strategic policy and our foreign policy are now looking under very severe pressure, whether it is the way in which the US is redefining its role in the world, whether it's the way in which the rules-based international order is being challenged, whether it's the way in which the strategic consequences of China's economic rise are now becoming more apparent and of more concern. And the bad news is that we will look at the last 4 decades as our salad days, and those salad days are coming to an end. And by that I mean the combination of strong economic growth and strategic stability in our region is something that we can no longer assume. Now, at the heart of a lot of the churn that's happening geopolitically is what is happening in the US-China relationship and the way in which China's own strategic ambitions are becoming more evident. But I think it would be a mistake to think about transition in geopolitics as all about China or all about the US-China relationship, because there are many other things occurring in our external environment which I think are also going to be very important for Australia. The United States, which has been our major strategic ally, the world's largest economy, arguably in terms of Australia's economic interests, still our most important economic partner if you add investment and trade. The US, in my view, is going through something of a socio-cultural crisis. And I think that socio-cultural crisis, to a large extent, explains the rise of figures like Donald Trump, and I think it has a way to go before it washes its way through the US system. The US, I think, has faced, in many ways, a perfect storm in the way in which the losers of globalization, the ascent of identity politics, and the weariness with global leadership has come together to fundamentally shift its political focus. And if you're looking for a statistic to help you explain the rise of Donald Trump, bear this in mind. In the 3 years before Trump's election, the life expectancy of US males declined, these so-called deaths of despair. And in many ways, that's a reflection of this deeper socio-cultural convulsion, in my view, that the US is going through. Closer to home, we are now living in an Asian environment where a number of different countries are emerging to stronger positions. So the Asian story is by no means just a China story. We have economies like India and Indonesia. We've got Southeast Asia as a trading entity, also now becoming major players. And I'd like to return to some of those key regional relationships because I think they're going to matter a lot to our future, including to our future as an agricultural exporter. At the heart of the US-China geopolitical challenge is a very simple proposition. And there are two irreconcilable strategic ambitions that are now driving US-China relations. And put simply, China wants to become the predominant power in this part of the world, at least in the Indo-Pacific, if not globally. And the United States is determined not to cede that position to China. The idea of America as number one is deeply embedded in the DNA of Americans, and the idea that China would displace the United States is something which US strategic policy will not countenance, in my view, for some time yet. Now, all of this is going to place Australia in a rather difficult position. we have been huge beneficiaries of US global leadership. We've been huge beneficiaries of US strategic predominance. Both of those things have created, if you like, the underlying environment in which the Asian growth story has been able to thrive. Now, I'm a complete agnostic on the question of whether China is going to become a more powerful country than the United States. I think those that project the future of China based on its past performance miss a great deal of brittleness and structural challenges in the Chinese system, and to assume that China will continue on the trajectory that it's been on for the last 3 or 4 decades, I think, is a very heroic assumption. China ultimately faces a very large challenge in balancing its economic ambitions with its political ambitions. And the one thing we know about Xi Jinping's leadership is that the politics of the party, the authority of the party, the control of the party is non-negotiable, and everything else is secondary. And so this is the big conundrum for China's future. How do you maintain strong economic growth, which ultimately requires a more market-based economy, and an economy where the market is the larger determinant of how resources are distributed, with a political system which is intent on maintaining its monopoly on authority. And we've already seen in China a walking back from economic reform precisely because the political consequences in terms of political control are unacceptable. Now, there's nothing surprising in any economy or any society with politicians walking back from reform because they worry about what it means for their political base. But it is a bigger issue in China simply because the underlying compact in the Chinese system is that the party delivers you economic growth and you in turn accept its monopoly on political power. So how China will juggle that with an economy that slows, either because of shocks such as Corona, but in my view, in the longer term, more likely because of the high level of state control in the economy. How do you maintain that compact in those circumstances? Now, while I'm an agnostic on whether China or the US will remain the stronger power, one thing I am absolutely certain about is that China will never be stronger than the aggregate power of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, the so-called quadrilateral grouping. And that is why I think the big challenge, the big strategic challenge for the countries in our region is how do you construct a new strategic equilibrium which does 2 things. One, it keeps engagement with China close to the center of our policy, because I think the alternative is not in anyone's interests. But 2, that it has the weight to constrain China's behavior, not to contain China, which I think is both geopolitical and economic folly, but to constrain China's behavior. And constructing that equilibrium, I think, is going to be one of the big tasks for Australian strategic policy. Now, I think one of the conclusions we should draw from all of this is that it is important for Australia to be spreading its risk. Now, we hear a lot about spreading risk at the moment vis-a-vis China because of corona, and I'm the Chancellor of a university, and I understand very well how we do need to spread our risk. And as we spread our risk, it means putting a lot more attention on some of our other regional relationships. And let me just talk a little bit about Japan, India, and Indonesia in that context. Japan, of course, for us is a very mature relationship, including on the trade side and including on the agricultural side. But Japan is facing some very serious structural challenges. Part of it flow from the fact that its remarkably successful post-war economic model is no longer quite as nimble or quite as adaptable to a very different global economy than it needs to be. Part of it flows from a very big demographic challenge in the aging of the Japanese population, and a challenge made much more difficult by the cultural hesitation that Japan has to engage in a large-scale immigration program, which at one level would be the obvious answer to Japan's demographic challenge. But notwithstanding all of the difficulties that the Japanese economy faces, and notwithstanding the fact that it's been bouncing around the bottom for quite a little while, and its most recent quarterly GDP figures show a dramatic plunge off the back of changes to the consumption tax, we're dealing in Japan with an economy of remarkable depth and sophistication, an economy of great weight, and an economy that Australia dismisses or treats less seriously at our own peril. So I think that economic relationship with Japan will continue to be hugely important to us. And what we have seen in our relationship with Japan now is a real ramping up of our strategic partnership with Japan, much of it based on a mutual interest in balancing China, much of it based on our respective similarity of views as allies of the United States, but also, I think, importantly, much of it based on our shared understanding of the importance of a strong rules-based system and a refusal to accept that that is dead and buried, even though at another level it may well be on life support. So building further this already well-established relationship is going to be hugely important. India is a proposition of a different kind. We need to be building something for the long term. Now, India is one of those countries where potential is always around the corner and never realized. But I think there are some good, deeper structural reasons for Australia giving more serious attention to India. In 2018, I did a report to the then Prime Minister on a 20-year strategy, an economic strategy for Australia. And what I concluded there was that there was no single market over the next 20 years which offered more growth opportunities for Australia than the Indian market. And that's based essentially on a judgment about some of the underlying drivers of economic growth in India. So India is already the third largest economy in the world if you measure it by purchasing power parity. It's number 5 or number 6 if you measure it by US market exchange rates. And if you take that economy and assume, as I did, a growth rate of around 6 to 8% a year and fast forward it for over 20 years, you're dealing with something of real significance. And the important point for Australia, I think, is not just the scale of the Indian economy, but ultimately the complementarity of our two economies. And by that I mean, as an Indian economy grows, more of the things that it will need and will be unable to provide of its own resources, although its instinct will always be to try and do that, Australia will be well placed to provide. And amongst that is obviously agricultural product and partnerships on agribusiness. And I see agribusiness as in the top 4 sectors for the future economic relationship with India. And in my report, I suggested we set a target of trebling our exports to India by 2035 and increasing by a factor of 10 our outward investment in India. That's based on a judgment that India's protectionism will continue to dominate its economic thinking, but that its openness to foreign investment is likely to get better rather than worse. Now, at the moment, I think there are 2 clouds on the India horizon. One is that the government seems to have lost interest in any economic reform, and as a result, we're seeing Indian growth coming in most recently at around 4.5%, which is way below what India needs and way below what India can achieve with something resembling a more active economic reform agenda. And secondly, the politics of India now is being driven by the pursuit of a Hindu nationalist agenda, which, if not constrained, will have a big impact on India's character as a liberal secular democracy. And that character, in my view, is fundamental to the way in which we think about India as a strategic partner, because particularly if you're thinking about how do you put together a new strategic equilibrium to balance China, the reason you're doing that is essentially a judgment based on values, because you're seeking to balance a system which is essentially at its core in China an authoritarian one-party system, and you want partners in that exercise who share a basic fundamental commitment to more open and more democratic societies. Indonesia, which is a country that Australia always struggles, in my view, to understand and engage with the intensity that our interests actually demand, is itself going through a profound transformation. We're seeing an Indonesian politics which is becoming more influenced by political Islam, and that will also, in my view, have an impact on its economic thinking. You're dealing with a society where self-sufficiency is a much adhered to creed. You're dealing with a trade policy which, notwithstanding, I think, some very significant improvements, is still fundamentally cautious about opening up the Indonesian economy to foreign suppliers. And you're also dealing with an Indonesian system which is now operating off a much more decentralized model than we've been accustomed to. But Indonesia will, by most projections, be in the top 6 economies in the world by 2035, say. And so it's very much in our interests for Australia and Indonesia to be forging a much closer relationship, not just at the strategic level for obvious reasons, but also importantly at the economic level. And in this relationship, as in our others in Asia, we need to be speaking much more the language of partnership, and where we can serve each other's interests together rather than simply thinking about them as markets that need to be penetrated. And of course, in Indonesia, you'll find both complementary and competitive elements in the trading relationship. So the more we can build up that partnership, and the red meat sector is a very good example of where longer term thinking on partnership, not just on landing produce, will get us a better outcome. And then we've got ASEAN as an entity where, again, I think Australia has, if anything, underestimated the economic integration of Southeast Asia. For all of the frustrations of dealing with ASEAN as a grouping, if you plot its development over time, it has moved closer and closer to the goal of a single trade and investment grouping, and a grouping obviously of some very considerable weight. And I think it's important for Australia, as we map our own economic interests into the future, to be thinking more about how we relate to ASEAN as a grouping. The other thing which I think is very important for us to do is to try and revive where we can, at a more global level, a commitment to a rules-based trading system. At the moment, the WTO is going through a very difficult period. The United States, which historically has been the biggest champion of trade liberalisation within the WTO, is under the Trump administration adopting a very different policy. All of that means that the days of a global trade round, which some would argue probably died half a dozen years ago, are now well beyond our reach. But it does mean that Australia needs to put significant effort into fallback arrangements, whether they are regional arrangements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership or RCEP, and also for us to be putting effort into bilateral trade agreements. Not that bilateral trade agreements are the be-all and the end-all of a trading relationship, but they clearly are better than not having an agreement, and that while they may not shift the dial fundamentally, they do make it easier for our exporters, and they do contribute to our economic growth and prosperity as a result. So let me just conclude with a couple of observations about what this all means for Australia, and some of these points I think have been very well picked up by Steve and Stephen. I think we're going to be navigating a world where we are going to have to depend much more on ourselves and our own resources and our own capabilities. I'm not arguing that we're going to be a lonely country into the future. I don't think we will be, and particularly if we're smart about the way that we go about building those regional relationships. But we are going to have to make our own way in the world in a way perhaps that we have not had to in the last couple of decades. And I think that's going to be a challenge for us at a number of levels. Secondly, I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to our resilience as a nation and as an economy. And whether that is rediscovering a productivity agenda or investing in a future that is more tilted towards innovation. And David Littleproud referred to our great achievements in research and innovation. And I think Australia does have a very proud record on that. But it does worry me that we are now either at the bottom or the second from the bottom of the OECD tables on investment in research and development. And ultimately, if something is a priority, it needs to be reflected in your investment decisions. I think we need a lot more investment in Australia in both our hard and soft power. One of the consequences of being more on your own is that you have to be able to defend yourself without drawing on or depending on too many external variables, and that means a much bigger investment in our own defence capabilities. It also means, in my view, very importantly, a much bigger investment in our soft power, and particularly our diplomacy, because so much of our nimbleness as a nation in what is a very fluid strategic environment is going to depend on our ability to forge those relationships. I've spoken about spreading risk. I think that's absolutely fundamental for a prudent strategy for Australia into the future. And the last point I would make, to get back to my ecosystem beginning, is that when we think about our strategies, we need to make sure that we can weave the threads of our economic, our security, and our strategic interests much more closely together. So I hope my comments this morning have helped you at least put some of those economic threads alongside important geopolitical trends. Thank you very much.